thanks a lot for joining us today. We are actually having a very interesting day wherein we are trying to understand as to how India could be a more prosperous place, how India could actually have its industries which are far more competitive and far more productive. What we are going to do is that we are going to have a keynote from Dr. Debroy, who is the member with Niti, Aayog. He has been an economist over the last 35 years, but I think he has done a lot of work on Indian mythology, on the Vedas, on Ramayana, on the Gita, and so on and so forth. I hope you've read his Mahabharata, which is again a piece of art. So that is where it is. In fact, he has been instrumental in really coming out with the state rankings in India. So it was actually a very interesting work which set the tone of how to really measure how states are doing and how they can be more productive and how they can be more competitive. So he does a report, or has been doing it for a number of years, the state of the states work. So that's his biggest contribution from my point of view of what has really happened. And then, of course, we have two panels today wherein we are going to be discussing two very interesting points. So we have two colleagues from US and UK, Shankar from the Legatum Institute and Srinivasa from the Babson College. In fact, Srinivas is an expert on strategy. So we have a common thread going there because both of us have worked with Michael Porter at some stage in our life or career. So it's a great connection and good to know you. I just met him yesterday for the first time, but it's been a delight to know him. Shankar, thanks a lot for really being here. So these two gentlemen are actually going to be sharing their points of view on how India could be more prosperous. They're talking about issues on competitiveness and so on and so forth. They are going to be sharing examples from the aviation industry and the cotton industry and things. And we are also having some of my good friends. We have Wilfred Alber, who's not here right now. His flight just landed a little late. He should be here any moment. We have Dr. Ajit Prasad, who's been a friend, philosopher, and guide, who's now the director at IIM Lucknow. And I think I owe a lot to him as I became a faculty. So he's at the back, so he's also there where he's going to be speaking and so on and so forth. So I think it's a great day today. And without further ado, can I request Dr. Debroy to present his keynote? In fact, after this, we'll have Anil Padmanabhan, who's going to do the Q&A. Anil is one of the naughtiest, what do you call, editors you'll ever meet. But that's where it is. Just God forbid that he does not use the dirty words.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Amit, for having invited me here. And thank you for saying he has been an economist and using the past tense. According to the program, it says, how is India growing economically? Which tends to suggest that I should talk about GDP numbers and whether 7.6% is to be believed or is not to be believed. I will not get into that, but leave it to Anil to provoke me on those kinds of issues when we have the interaction subsequently. Instead, what I propose to do in my initial talk is to look at the issue of prosperity from the perspective of what the government, the present government, is trying to do. Because that probably is much more of value addition to an audience like this. I think the first point the first issue, which is an obvious one, but is sometimes often missed, is that the government that was elected in May 2014 is a union government. Depending on the year, 90 to 95% of India's national income originates in the states. This is a union government, this is a federal structure, although the word federal has a certain legal nuance, and therefore the word federal is not used in the Constitution. A large part of the action or inaction is going to be at the level of the states. Not only this, the government that was elected in May 2014 is in the nature of an executive. According to the Constitution, there are two other organs of state as well, the legislative part and the judiciary. You cannot expect the executive to take action ignoring that a legislature exists and ignoring the fact that a judiciary exists. Nor is it the case that the Prime Minister ever said, or anyone in government ever said, that we will accomplish everything that we want to do in the first 100 days, or in the first 1 year, or even in the first 2 years. To the extent that I can understand what the Prime Minister is trying to do, it is a 10-year-long agenda. In terms of that 10-year time frame, the compulsions and the priorities about what needs to be done will fundamentally have to be determined internally in accordance with whatever are the domestic priorities. The next point I want to flag is this issue of prosperity and asking the question, are people voluntarily poor? Or to rephrase it, are able-bodied people in working age groups voluntarily poor? The answer should be that no able-bodied person in the working age groups is voluntarily poor, because everyone wants to better his or her life. So why are people poor? People are poor because they fundamentally lack access to several things that many of us take for granted. They don't have access to the legal system, the dispute resolution mechanism. They do not have access to roads, water, electricity. They do not have access to primary health centers, schools, literacy, education. They do not have access to financial markets. They do not have access to information technology. They do not have access to land markets, all of that. So the interpretation of inclusion under this government is not doles and subsidies. The interpretation of inclusion for this government is delivering those things to people who have been deprived more than 65 years after independence. India has 600,000 villages. About 150,000 of these villages even today lack the items I have described. Out of these 150,000 villages, 100,000 villages have population sizes that are less than 500. If the population size is less than 500, it becomes extremely, extremely difficult to deliver some of the things that I have mentioned. So one agenda for this government, and you will see that in the initiatives on roads, railways, power, and increasingly now toilets, education, health, is on ensuring that these are delivered. I don't know how many of you have visited the Northeast. If you're familiar with the Northeast, you will be aware symbolically how important it has been, and perhaps it's more than symbol. Symbolically how important it has been that now finally, so many years after independence, I have a railway line in my state. So many years after independence, I have an airport in my state. So part of that inclusion also is to mainstream parts of India that have been deprived in terms of that physical connectivity, be it the Northeast, be it Jammu and Kashmir. The next question that arises is, where do I find those resources? Because I have to find the resources. But even before finding the resources, how do I identify people who will nonetheless, at least in the interim, be deprived and poor and therefore be the beneficiaries of subsidies? We have, those of you who know about India will be aware that since 1991, when this cycle of reform started, we have gone round and round in circles trying to identify the poor, the BPL households below the poverty line. The only way you can satisfactorily identify whether a household is poor or is not is by doing a decentralized census. A survey, which is not a census, does not enable me to identify whether Shankar's household is poor or not. I can do that only through a decentralized census. Having done that, I need to put up that information on the panchayat, which is the local body at the local level, on the panchayat wall, so that Anil can come along and complain and say, Shankar is not poor, why have you included his name? Or Anil can come along and complain, saying, why have you not included Sanjay's name? Because Sanjay is poor. What some people are generally unaware is this census, known as the SECC, which was done in the year 2011-12, it is a census, was not approved and implemented. The SECC has now been implemented and accepted by this government as a basis for deprivation criteria, so that you can unambiguously identify which household is poor. In passing, let me also mention something that provokes a lot of people, which is that traditionally we have often tried to equate deprivation with community characteristics, collective characteristics, ethnicity, gender, caste, religion. The trouble with doing that is, if I do that, I make a double mistake. I might include people who should not be included simply because they happen to be part of that collective category, and I exclude people who should be included because they don't happen to be part of that collective category. This entire SECC exercise shifts the focus to the household. The next piece of the jigsaw that I want to mention is something again that you are probably aware of, which is something called the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, under which people who have not had bank accounts now have bank accounts. And if you look at the numbers, and the numbers are being cleaned up, it's not that all the numbers are entirely perfect. All of these are not necessarily new accounts. The numbers are being cleaned up. But if you look at those numbers, the debate about financial inclusion in terms of getting bank accounts to people is over and done with. Because most people now finally have bank accounts. It is a different matter that there aren't enough financial products to persuade people to use these bank accounts. So the debate in a sense shifts from opening the bank accounts to devising financial products so that people with these new no-frill accounts actually begin to use their bank accounts. And the government has tried to do that for pensions. It has tried to do it for insurance, both medical and life. The success is a little bit more for pensions, a little bit less as of today for things like life insurance, but that's the way we are headed. The next thing that I should mention in this connection, so I've got the SECC, I've got the Jan Dhan Yojana accounts, and now I want to mention the Aadhaar biometry. The Aadhaar biometry is now being integrated into these. So effectively, I will have direct benefit transfers in the form of cash. These are early days. It has been experimented with substantially only for the sake or only for the case of kerosene, apart from pensions and scholarships. The results are a bit too varied because these are early days, but that's the direction in which we are headed. The next point I want to mention is an issue of raising resources for this entire exercise, whether it is the subsidies, whether it is the delivery of the physical infrastructure. Let me give you two figures, one of which you are familiar with, the other one you may be unfamiliar with. The figure you are familiar with is that the union government as well as the states, as taxes we collect 17% of GDP. So 17% of GDP is collected by the union government and the states as taxes. This is a figure that some of you know. What some of you may not know is that all subsidies taken together account for 14% of GDP. When I say all subsidies, I'm not talking about union government subsidies alone. I'm also talking about state government subsidies. When I say subsidies, I'm not talking only about explicit subsidies that are provided out of the budget, also the implicit subsidies. I'm not only talking about consumption subsidies, I'm also talking about production subsidies. So if I'm collecting 17% in the form of taxes and 14% goes as subsidies, then it is perfectly understandable why I've not been able to deliver the required inputs after so many years. I should also mention that about 5.5% of GDP, 5 to 5.5% of GDP goes in the form of tax exemptions. Direct, indirect, personal income tax, excise, whole lot. So part of the agenda, the incomplete agenda, is also to simplify the taxation system, both on the direct side as well as on the indirect side, rationalize, harmonize, standardize, of which GST is only one small element, remove the exemptions, make compliance costs lower, and also in the process generate the resources that you need. As you were told in the introduction, I work for Niti Aayog, which is a successor to the Planning Commission. One of the most important institutional changes that has happened is a change that I now want to mention. Quite often it has been argued that in terms of governance, India is excessively centralized. There are too many things that are being determined and decided in Delhi. Sometimes that happened for historical reasons as part of the colonial legacy, further accentuated by the process of planning post-1947. So the argument has always been for greater decentralization, which is not simply fiscal devolution. One of the changes that has happened under this government, which is reflected in the mandate that Niti has, which is distinct from the Planning Commission, is in terms of this devolution and decentralization, which is not just fiscal. Let me give you an example to illustrate what I mean. There used to be a program called, it still exists, called the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. What did it do? It provided union government money to build rural roads. The template for that PMGSY was devised in my predecessor organization, the Planning Commission. And what did that template say? It said you could build a rural road, but if a bridge needed to be constructed on that road, that was not part of the PMGSY. So you had roads without bridges. If you are relatively cash rich like Gujarat, you supplemented that with your own state level scheme so that the bridge could be built. If you are relatively cash starved like Jharkhand, you had roads without any bridges. I can give you countless examples of this. The new set of such public expenditure schemes has not been devised by Niti Aayog. It has not been devised by the Prime Minister's office. It has not been devised by North Bloc. Instead, subgroups of chief ministers have been set up to recommend what these public expenditure schemes should be. And the report is in the public domain. There are 2 or 3 last points that I want to mention, and then I will stop. And the 2 that I want to mention are 2 that obviously interest you. One is land, and the other one is labor. In the case of labor, we have a constitution, we have a 7th schedule to the constitution, which sets out very clearly what the union government should do, what state government should do, and what is on the so-called concurrent list. Labor is on the concurrent list, though most of the labor legislation is actually union government. What the union government is planning to do, over and above what some state governments had done in terms of reforming their labor laws, is to rationalize and harmonize all of those labor laws under 4 heads as a terminal goal. One is wage related, second is social security related, third is safety related, and the 4th one is industrial relations related. So essentially, about 50 odd labor laws will be rationalized and harmonized under 4 codes. Finally, land. Most of you present here know that we have a 2013 law which makes it very, very difficult to acquire land. And this government tried to amend that, it didn't quite work. What some people, even apparently aware people, don't seem to know, that land is not on the concurrent list. Land is squarely on the state list. So if I go by the spirit of the Constitution, not the legality of the Constitution, that 2013 statute enacted by Parliament was antithetical to the spirit of the Constitution, because land was on the state list. So the last sentence is, given India's stage of development, there's a great deal of heterogeneity across states, but given India's state of development, a large part of the growth will come from enhancing the use of factor inputs, including things like female work participation rates, which are extremely low, and from more efficient usage of existing factor inputs. It's not so much total factor productivity, not yet, not generally. And there's a great deal of heterogeneity. States differ, 29 states, but you can see the beginnings of that change happening in at least half of those states. Amit mentioned the state rankings that Lavish Bhandari and I used to do. Whenever I presented those state findings, initially I used to say half the states are below average, and people got very upset. State chief ministers who were present, they got very upset. Then I switched to saying half the states are above average, and everyone was happy. So half the states are above average even today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Debroy, for this stunning address. Can we have the 2 chairs, please? You have exactly 10 minutes.
Oh, 10 minutes.
Because
I have one question and I think I'm sure they'll have.
he has to leave at 9:35.
Where do you want to sit?
Okay, skip the chair.
Nini, come on, sit now.
I think you don't need to hear me, but since he's just got 10 minutes, I'll just fire one question to him, which I think might be useful to all of you too. And I'm sure you would like to also ask him a few questions before he gets on. Okay. Bibek, just the one point, outstanding, by the way. Thank you for setting out the ideological perspective of this government. If I may sum it up, it is like empowerment versus entitlement. Clearly, empowerment is the way to go. So the states, the point on states that you mentioned where you signed off, that most of the action will come from states. My question to you is, now that you have fiscal development, greater fiscal development, you're getting more action in the states, all kinds of activities are beginning. Do all states have the capacities to absorb this extra money that's coming their way, or is it going to be a work in progress?
This requires a long answer because everyone here may not be familiar with the context against which Anil is asking the question. The devolution to states happens through 2 channels. One is the Finance Commission, and the second one used to be the Historical Planning Commission. What he's alluding to is the last Finance Commission, the 14th Finance Commission's recommendation, which suggested an increase in the share of states in the divisible pool of resources from 32% to 42%. So that's a very sharp, unprecedented increase in the untied, and this is untied. So the union government has no control over what the states are going to spend this on. What again I want to flag is something that Anil is familiar with, that the Finance Commission had a minute of dissent. And the minute of dissent was based exactly on what Anil has said, that do the states have the capacity, or are they going to fritter these resources away? On balance, the Finance Commission recommended that no, states will never develop the capacity unless you actually give them the money. And within government, there was a considerable amount of debate about whether the Finance Commission's recommendation should be accepted in entirety, or should it be staggered, increased from 32% to 37% and subsequently increased to 42%. The consensus was, no, federal structure doesn't matter, we'll see what happens. And you're absolutely right that the debate is not just about devolution from the union government to states. It should increasingly be about devolution and decentralization within states, which is where the state finance commissions come in. Some states had existing finance commissions. Others, like Rajasthan, have set up a new finance commission. Finance commission recommendations are, of course, not binding on states. So yes, it is the case that some states will use this money efficiently, and yes, it is the case that some states will just fritter it away. But I think that's a sort of part of life, and sooner or later the citizens of that state will punish misgovernance.
I'll just time for one quick question because we're really out of time. So short question, no comments. Question.
Okay, I am Anjalan Chopra. I'm a happy platinum veteran. 3 bullet points since I'm a general. 1, access. You've talked of 10 years, not 1 year, 2 years, or 100 days. The expectations of the people of India have been raised so high, I don't think they are having the patience to wait 10 years, which you know sitting in Niti Aayog. That's point number 1. Number 2, you've talked of the Northeast, and I'm very glad. I've spent 11 years there. You have two more problems in the Northeast. One, they are not in the mainstream. They feel they're not in the mainstream. My, of course, view is that we should take the mainstream to them. And two, they're much more educated than the rest of India. So to them, access becomes even more important. And the last point, which is, I think, the most important, perception. The perception in the country is that the executive, although you try to clarify it, is being a bit dictatorial. Number two, the legislation is not being taken into confidence, except GST, which you said is a very minor part of taxation. And finally, the judiciary seems to be ignored. Now, these three affect, and finally, since I'm a general again, civil-military relations have taken a big dip. This affects security, which affects economy. You might like to ponder on these three aspects. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Well, there are too many comments for me to react, and they were in any case comments. But on each of these, you see, let me just pick up two or three. Firstly, expectations in any country are always disproportionate to what you can deliver. So that's sort of part of life. It's almost a truism. Civil-military relations, I don't think they have perceptibly deteriorated since 2014, unless you are talking about things like OROP, which is a sort of blip. Civil-military relations have always been a problem, but as I said, I don't think they've perceptibly deteriorated. On mainstreaming the Northeast, a question that I invariably ask people, I'm not asking you, is please name the capitals of all the northeastern states. And most people, I'm not asking you the question either, most people fail to answer that. But there is a serious issue about the Northeast, and I just want to expand on what he has said. Sitting here in Delhi, we often tend to think of the Northeast as a homogeneous category. They aren't. They are very heterogeneous states. You have a massive state like Arunachal, which suffers from physical connectivity even today. You have states, Sikkim is a different basket altogether. You have states like Assam and Tripura, which are different. And you have a certain degree of commonality across Meghalaya, Mizoram, Manipur, and Nagaland. What I quickly want to bring to your attention is the fact that this part of the country, historically, not even 1947, what killed it was 1935. If you look back and look at it historically, it was integrated economically with the neighboring countries. No matter what you do with the chicken's neck, no matter what you do about connectivity through Bangladesh, economic prosperity for that part will not happen until the economic integration happens with Southeast Asia and perhaps even China.
Before we just wind up, just wanted to share with you, most of you may not be aware, Bibek in the 90s did this fantastic project about rationalizing old laws, the redundant laws. Remember your project? So which is now being productionized. I'm not sure if that's the basis, but they've begun to get rid of all old laws dating back to 18th century and things like that.
No, you're sort of tempting me. Again, let me give you two bits of information that you may not be aware of. When this government came into being, there were roughly about 2,500 statutes, 2,500 union level statutes. The number of union level statutes is now down to about 500. About 1,200 old statutes have already been repealed in 4 bills. Also, the Rajasthan government had 900 statutes. The number of statutes after repeal and rationalization, harmonization is down to about 250 now.
Well, that's also big ticket reforms, which normally doesn't get the kind of press that other things do get. Okay, Bibek, thank you so much.
Okay,
Always a
thank
pleasure
you.
to speak to you.